Tonight on KQED Newsroom, President Trump says he has contracted the coronavirus, sending a jolt to the presidential campaign just days after an explosive first presidential debate. We get the latest. Also, as fire continues to ravage California, we talk with KQED reporters about the findings of their deep investigation into the particular fire danger to seniors. Welcome to KQED Newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. The world is responding to news that President Trump says he and First Lady Melania Trump have tested positive for the coronavirus. The president's diagnosis comes just 2 days after the spectacle of the first presidential debate held in Cleveland, Ohio. The candidates could have chosen to provide some inspiration or guidance, qualities in short supply in this strange and difficult year. Instead, ignited by a bellicose President Trump, the night devolved into a mean-spirited shouting match that wouldn't be tolerated in a middle school mock debate. Unprofessional, unpresidential, and frequently unlistenable, this debate was so profoundly troubled that the Commission on Presidential Debates has announced it will change the format before the next one. And with just about a month until Election Day, most counties will start mailing out ballots to all registered voters in California next week. Joining me now by Skype from San Francisco is KQED Senior Editor of Politics and Government, Scott Shafer. Also joining by Skype is KQED Politics and Government reporter Guy Marzorati. Gentlemen, thank you both so much for joining. Scott, let's start with you. This has been another whirlwind week, and yet we're not talking about how much Trump didn't pay in his taxes. We're not talking about his Supreme Court nominee. We're not talking about the debate, not yet at least. We're starting off talking about how he says he and the First Lady have contracted the coronavirus. How do you see this playing out in his campaign, and particularly in battleground states like Wisconsin, which has seen some of the worst coronavirus outbreaks in the nation?
Yeah, I mean, this was a shocker. I don't think anybody saw coming, although given that the president rarely wears a mask and is often seen in groups of people who aren't wearing masks, maybe it should not have been a surprise that this happened, but it did, and it has upended the campaign with, just a little over a month to go. People are already voting in many parts of the country. It really, how this affects the campaign going forward, really, I think, depends on the course of his disease. Is he going to get sicker? Is he going to get so sick that he's incapacitated in some way? That's what happened to Boris Johnson in Great Britain. And so it really depends. Right now, there are reports that he is getting some sort of experimental treatment for fatigue. That's not a good sign because immediately we know he does have symptoms. He is 74 years old and overweight. So he, people will be watching this very carefully. In terms of the impact in places like Wisconsin, he wanted to go to Wisconsin this week, and the mayor of La Crosse, Wisconsin, begged him not to because the numbers of cases there are going up through the roof. And the last thing they want is a big gathering. So I think this is going to bring home, obviously, it's going to make a focus of healthcare, the COVID pandemic, and the way he's handled this. And he's sort of a victim of his own sloppiness and refusal to listen to experts and scientists.
I'd like to turn now to the presidential debate that happened earlier in the week. President Trump seemed to send a chilling message when he said, quote, "Proud Boys, stand back and stand by," words which were immediately celebrated by white supremacists on social media. And the president later said that he had used those words to encourage this group, which he said he doesn't know who they are, but he used those words to encourage them to not interfere with law enforcement. Scott, what sort of an impact did this language have on the race?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, there's a relatively small number of undecided voters at this point. Very unusual. And so I think the people who are up for grabs, the voters who perhaps voted for Trump 4 years ago, they're a little bit on the fence, and I'm thinking now suburban women in particular are really going to be turned off by this sort of thing. This is not what they want to hear from the commander-in-chief, and it has happened time and time again. I don't think the word racist is too strong to describe, at the very least, his actions and his comments. And so I think in that sense, it does refocus the problem that he's had for 4 years now in addressing this very radical right-wing part of his base and refusing to condemn them. So I do think, on the margins, it is going to hurt him probably with voters who are up in the air or perhaps were leaning toward Biden I think it's going to push them a little further in that direction.
Guy, with the language that was presented during the debate, did you feel that either candidate was reaching more towards undecided voters or more towards encouraging their base? Is there a constituency they're aiming for?
Well, interestingly enough, I felt like the president spent a disproportionate amount of time trying to appeal to Joe Biden's base when he talked about Biden's record on criminal justice and some sentencing laws that he authored in the 90s, even when he spent the entire vote by mail section kind of talking about these false claims that there's going to be widespread vote by mail fraud. I think the audience for that was really maybe unlikely voters or liberal voters, and just trying to generally discourage people through misinformation about the voting process, ultimately bring down turnout.
Scott, during the debate, President Trump pointed to his accomplishments in shifting the American judiciary to the right. And I'd like to listen to that for a moment.
And I'll tell you something, some people say maybe the most important. By the end of the first term, I'll have approximately 300 federal judges and Court of Appeals judges, 300, and hopefully 3 great Supreme Court justices. That is a record the likes of which very few people, and you know one of the reasons I'll have so many judges?
So whether or not he wins the election, his legacy is certainly going to be felt in the courts for many years to come. Is this one of the cornerstones of his campaign, along with economic progress, economic growth, and how is it resonating?
Well, this is exactly what his base, the evangelical voters, wanted him to do. Remember, in 2016, toward the end of the campaign, he came up with a list. There were people who didn't feel convinced that he was actually a conservative. You know, he used to be pro-choice, and he wasn't always a Republican. So he came up with a list of judges from which he would choose for the courts, and including the Supreme Court, and he has stuck to that. And he's right. I mean, he has a historic number of appointees now sitting at the district court level, at the appeals court level, and perhaps 2 or 3 on the Supreme Court. So that is a record and a legacy that will last long beyond him, whether or not he gets reelected in November. So it is certainly a promise made and a promise kept, which is of great consternation to Democrats and people who care about the issues that could come before the Supreme Court. For example, the Affordable Care Act, which will be heard right after the election, the week after the election, and is at risk of being struck down. That would have huge implications for people who currently rely on health care from the Affordable Care Act. And the list goes on, women's right to choose and so on. So he's right. I mean, that is the thing is, though, I don't think that appeals to swing voters. That's his base that cares most about that.
Guy, let's turn to mail-in ballots, which have started to be sent out and will continue over the coming weeks. You've been doing some reporting specifically on this. What have you learned about how California state officials are ensuring the integrity of the voting process here in California? And perhaps you could broaden that out to tell us about other battleground states as well.
Right. Well, here in California, we are expecting a historic participation in vote by mail. There was a poll this week from the Berkeley Institute of Governmental Studies that found 78% of California voters are planning to vote by mail. So how are officials preparing for that? On the front end, it's a lot of encouragement to get those ballots in early. They're going to be allowed to start counting ballots, opening them, preparing them for a final count, not releasing or finalizing any tallies until Election Day. And that's a key difference with other states where the ballots are pretty much going to be untouched until Election Day. It's why in many states, many swing states, you might see a longer vote count. The issue here in California, it's not voter fraud when it comes to vote by mail. It's actually the issue of rejected ballots. And that could be because a ballot is postmarked too late, or maybe there's an issue with the signature. There's ways that election officials are trying to get around that. On the front end, it's really saying to voters, look, if you're going to hand in or mail in your ballot on Election Day or close to Election Day, use the drop box, don't use the USPS. There could be a longer time frame of delivery. And when it comes to issues with signatures, the so-called curing process with signatures, there's going to be opportunities for election officials after Election Day to reach out to voters if they forgot to sign their ballots, if they have an incorrect signature, to try to get that fixed and make sure their vote is counted.
Scott, let's turn to ballot measures in the state. Specifically, let's talk about Prop 15, which takes aim at the old Prop 13, which was passed in 1978, which looks at how property taxes are pegged, basically. It said property taxes would be pegged at the purchase point for a house. Now, there's a new prop on the ballot this year, which is Prop 15, which takes aim at a portion of the people who are impacted by Prop 13. And it says it's only for commercial landlords who have $3 million or more in holdings. How is this being received? Is there a chance it'll pass?
There is a chance it'll pass. It's been hovering right around 50%, which is what it needs in a couple of polls in the past couple of weeks. Prop 15 would be the first major change to Prop 13, which was 42 years ago. And what it would do is it would create a split roll, something that Democrats and liberals have wanted for a long time. You know, Prop 13 was sold as a way to help seniors stay in their homes because property taxes were really at the whim of local assessors, and they were going up really quickly in the late 1970s. And, you know, corporations have benefited tremendously from this because their taxes are based on the purchase price. Those properties don't turn over very much. And there's a loophole that allows them to avoid triggering a reassessment. Prop 15 would reassess all those corporate properties, and it would generate between $6.5 to $11.5 billion a year in new revenue that would go 60% to local governments, 40% to the schools. Businesses, not surprising, are opposed. They say this is the wrong time to raise taxes, but labor unions and a long list of Democrats, including Joe Biden, Governor Gavin Newsom, Kamala Harris, are all supporting it.
Guy, let's turn to another prop which is being watched across the nation. That's Prop 22. And this one relates specifically to gig workers. Can you tell us what it is and its chances of passing?
Right. This relates to gig workers specifically working for companies like Uber and Lyft. It would basically exempt those companies from state law and allow them to classify these workers as independent contractors instead of employees. That means Uber and Lyft would not have to pay into unemployment insurance, workers' comp. But they say if they're unsuccessful in getting this measure passed, they're going to have to raise prices, potentially drivers losing flexibility. And the spending has been incredible. Viewers have probably already seen the Yes on 22 commercials. It's only the beginning of October. This is already the most expensive ballot measure campaign in California history.
Scott, let's talk about Governor Newsom having signed some criminal justice legislation this week, which includes a ban on the use of chokeholds in the state. What else is in this package?
Well, probably the most important one was AB 1506, which advocates have wanted for a long time. It requires the Attorney General to do independent investigations of deadly police shootings of unarmed civilians. That's something Kamala Harris opposed. Javier Becerra opposed it, but the governor signed it. And then there were a number of bills that just died in the legislature to restrict rubber bullets, to further open up police records, that kind of thing. They just died at the end of August because there was a lack of time and a lot of opposition from law enforcement groups.
Before we go, the University of Utah has confirmed today that they will still host the vice presidential debate, which is set for next week. Guy, what are you going to be watching for as you view this debate? What should we be watching for at home?
Well, it's been interesting to see President Trump, despite all his law and order talk, also attack Joe Biden for his tough on crime policies of the 90s. It'll be interesting to see, does Mike Pence go after Kamala Harris's career as a prosecutor? He's more of a traditional Republican. I'm not sure how those attacks would land, but we'll see.
Scott?
For Kamala Harris, this will be the biggest audience she's ever had. She's got to basically press the case for Joe Biden and be seen as someone plausible who could become president of the United States if that need were to arise. She's got to be credible as a commander-in-chief.
Scott Shafer, Guy Marzorati, thank you both so much.
You're welcome.
As firefighters continue to battle blazes that have burned millions of acres in California, an investigation by KQED and CalMatters has found roughly 2 million people aged 65 and older live in areas at high risk for wildfires. The investigation also revealed that wildfires are a significant hazard for more than a third of nursing homes and other long-term care facilities in California. State law requires the facilities to have emergency plans and to conduct training and fire drills, but enforcement by state regulators is scarce, and emergency plans are a big question mark, leaving vulnerable seniors potentially exposed to deadly wildfires. Joining me now by Skype are the lead authors of the Older and Overlooked investigative series, KQED science reporter Molly Peterson and KQED senior producer and data journalist Lisa Pickoff-White. Ladies, thank you both for joining us. Molly, what prompted this investigation?
Well, two things really. At KQED Science on the radio side, reporters have been looking at the risks and the hazards associated with wildfire over the last several years. We've thought about where people build, what kind of requirements are around wild and urban interfaces, and that, of course, naturally that leads to who lives in these areas and who's at risk and how we protect them. Before that, I lived in Louisiana after Katrina, and I covered this very big nursing home disaster, the St. Rita's nursing home disaster, where people drowned in floodwaters of Hurricane Katrina. We've had more climate-driven disasters in the last decade and a half. And in California, that's certainly true with wildfires. So I've been thinking about this intersection of climate getting worse and a growing elder population in California.
The data was not just there to be simply picked up. This is something you really needed to dig into. Lisa, can you tell us about that process?
Yeah, so when Molly came to me well over a year ago to talk about this project, I was really excited because we knew that the first thing we needed to do was see where wildfire was a significant hazard in California. And so we worked with actually a large team to do that. We also worked with health reporter April Dembosky. And later on, we also brought in Lo Benishu, who worked at CalMatters and now at the Washington Post, who's a mapping expert. And we used two different maps to see where fire is a significant hazard, one created by the state and another created by scientists. We looked at those maps and then we looked at where facilities are and where people live in California. And combining all of that together, we were able to see that about a third of these long-term facilities and about a third of people 65 and older, that's 2 million people 65 and older in California, who are living in these fire-prone areas.
And so an example of that right now, Molly, you've been reporting on the Glass fire this week. Have you had a chance to talk with residents and people that had been part of the investigation earlier to follow up with them?
Right. Earlier this week, we saw older folks leaning on walkers and canes and slumped in chairs outside Veterans in Santa Rosa. We saw these buses driving through these embers late at night on Sunday night. And so we've been following up with facilities in the Santa Rosa area to see how they've evacuated, how they were prepared, what they thought they were going to do if they had to evacuate not to one location, but possibly to two if the fire spread. And I had a chance to speak to Jerry Canaday, who's a 68-year-old man who originally just saved his own life after the Tubbs fire by waking up in his Coffee Park home alone and walking outside to the sound of, trees snapping and these chunks of ash flying through the air. He's now evacuated 4 times since 2017. He's a senior. He's 68 years old.
Lisa, there are multiple obstacles that get in the way of improving safety at some of these senior care facilities, and one of those obstacles is just the demand for the services. Can you talk us through the demographics of seniors in California and why that gets in the way, why it bumps up against these safety protocols?
Yeah, we really have 2 shifts occurring at the same time. We have increasing climate change, which is making fires worse when they happen and more likely to. We also have an aging population. There are more seniors in California currently than in Florida. And we're expecting to see a doubling of older people in California in the next decade. Pretty soon we'll actually have a pretty high proportion of people who are older in our state. At the same time, we have housing problems that are changing where people live. And we also need beds for these people. On one hand, we're talking about how a lot of these facilities are in dangerous areas, but on the other hand, as our population ages, we also need skilled nursing facilities and residential care facilities where people can go and live safely.
Molly, what percentage of seniors are currently living in skilled nursing home facilities?
It's a relatively small percentage of seniors who live in long-term care facilities, including both the skilled nursing facilities, which are healthcare facilities regulated by the California Department of Public Health, and the long-term care facilities called assisted living informally, which are regulated by the California Department of Social Services. It's just around 4% of seniors, but that's hundreds of thousands of beds and people around the state.
So can you tell us about the state rules and regulations they need to follow, even though those facilities may be slightly different?
Right. Well, sir, with the assisted living facilities, there was this very dramatic abandonment of seniors in 2017 at Verena and Villa Capri in Santa Rosa. And that incident prompted increased scrutiny on these residential communities for the elderly, regulated by the Department of Social Services. Now those facilities have to have keys for transport available to all staff. They need to have more training for staff. They need to have things called evacuation chairs, which help people get downstairs who have limited mobility. And they have to have 2 evacuation destinations. And that's all as a result of the state bill AB 3098. So those state laws apply to the assisted living facilities. The increased scrutiny on emergency preparedness comes at the federal level and originates with those incidents I talked about at the beginning in Hurricane Katrina and on the Gulf Coast since then.
So there are some rules and regulations in place. Lisa, what is keeping these rules from being enforced? It seems like there's not enough regulatory oversight, and sometimes these facilities get to keep operating despite having violations.
Yes, it's very rare for facilities to be closed by the state, and it's also incredibly rare for them to be fined. For instance, in Villa Capri, which Molly was talking about, which was the facility where residents were, the state says that over 100 residents were abandoned at that facility and another facility during the Tubbs fire. They actually have paid no fines. Those 2 facilities did pay for monitoring fees, which came out to about $10,000. And that's about a month's rent for an individual could run up to that amount. When we've talked to state regulators, what they say is they really need to make sure that facilities stay open, that there's enough beds for seniors out there. When we talk to advocates, though, they say that they think regulators need to have more teeth, that if companies can just get a slap on the wrist, pay the fine, and move on, that they don't really have a reason to change what they're doing.
Molly, you mentioned that seniors are not all living in these facilities. Why is it that so many seniors seem to still choose to live in extremely fire-prone areas such as San Luis Obispo?
What we've seen with where seniors live, and we did a pretty basic analysis of this using census data, Lisa was in charge of that, is that seniors are making the same choices that we all are choosing, to live in risky areas. It's a statewide problem, and seniors are no different from anybody else.
Lisa, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, well, like what Molly said is when we did the assessment, we found that about 1/3 of Californians live in fire-prone areas, and seniors were similar. When we talked to experts about that, they said they would hope that seniors would live in less fire-prone areas, that they'd be attenuated to that risk. However, there's a lot of reasons for why people live where they live. I mean, you might have grown up in an area. You might think that a place is really beautiful and want to live there. Some people also say that housing may be a part of this. For instance, we have seen areas of California where there is some cheaper housing in the Sacramento Valley area, for instance, and in parts of the Sierras, where the older population is growing at an increased rate compared to other areas of California as well. But it's difficult to pin down one reason about why people live where they do.
So, Molly, in addition to the fire emergency and fire danger that these facilities have to plan for, they're also now dealing with the pandemic. How has the coronavirus impacted the planning for fire evacuations?
Well, I should say that certainly at the federal level, that emergency preparedness rule that requires them to prepare for fires would also require them to prepare for a pandemic, to prepare for flooding, to prepare for an active shooter situation or a mountain lion. I met one facility manager, Ray Boudwin, who works for Sequoia Living, which manages 3 Northern California properties, and he had a binder going through all of these things. With the pandemic specifically, infection control has always been a concern at skilled nursing facilities. For assisted living, we're talking about a new level of training where people have had to implement new controls and new practices in what is essentially not a healthcare facility. So it's just an additional burden on a system where we see that staffing is constantly a problem.
Lisa, what can a concerned family member do to help make sure that their parent or grandparent in one of these facilities is safe?
Well, the most important thing you can do is ask questions. Facilities are supposed to have plans, and you are allowed to see them. Molly wrote a guide that you can use that has questions that we suggest that you ask the facility. We suggest that you call them up. If you have a loved one who lives independently, it's also really important that that person knows when to evacuate. We've also talked to some community organizers. Listos is one, and there's other groups as well, where people have set up buddy systems for seniors and other older people, where someone might give them a call so that they know, hey, you need to really get out while you can, and here's where you can go.
Molly, tell us about the social and emotional impacts to seniors who are going through evacuations.
They're significant. We know, for example, that seniors with dementia are at elevated risk for dying in the months after a traumatic evacuation. The idea of transfer trauma extends to not just physical ailments, but also mental ones. And that's true for seniors, not just in facilities, but also living on their own. Jerry Canaday, who I mentioned earlier, whose house burned down in Coffey Park, moved to Oakmont Village and had to evacuate again this week. And he literally was carrying the baggage from all of that trauma, in the sense that he not only had his go bag, which he didn't know to make until we told him he was living in a risky area, but also all of the paperwork required to get through his life now.
Well, you bring up an interesting point that many seniors may not even know that they are living in a fire-prone area. Lisa, what's been the response to your reporting? Are you seeing more information coming out or any legislative or community action?
Well, shortly after our series aired, well into August, state regulators issued guidelines for facilities on how they should evacuate during COVID-19. However, another bill, SB 1207, failed, and that would have required that facilities have generators.
Lisa Pickoff-White, Molly Peterson, both with KQED, thank you so much for this important investigative work. You can read the older and overlooked investigative series and check out a very helpful interactive map on the wildfire risk to California seniors by going to kqed.org/wildfires. And you can find more of our coverage at kqed.org/kqed-newsroom. I'm Priya David Clemens. You can reach me on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Priya D. Clemens. Before we go, we want to bring you a look and a listen to something beautiful. For the past 19 years, Hardly Strictly Bluegrass has put on a free music festival the first weekend of October in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park. The annual 3-day festival celebrates roots music traditions across the country and has historically drawn more than 750,000 attendees. Due to the ongoing global pandemic, Hardly Strictly Bluegrass will celebrate its 20th anniversary online this year. The broadcast is being called Let the Music Play On and will feature performances by Emmylou Harris, the McCrary Sisters, Shaky Graves, and many more. You can stream the virtual festival starting Saturday by going to hardlystrictlybluegrass.com. Once there, you can also donate to the artists affected by COVID-19. From all of us here at KQED Newsroom, thanks for watching our show. Good night.
Do, 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 do.